Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. Wayne Gretzky called Hayley Wickenheiser the female Gordie Howe. She's one of the best women hockey players ever, winning 4 gold and 1 silver Olympic medals. She's also the first woman to play full-time men's professional hockey, not as a goalie. She is now Assistant General Manager of Player Development for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and if that weren't enough, a doctor specializing in emergency medicine. Welcome, Hayley.
Thanks for having me, Valerie.
You were a very ambitious little girl in small town Saskatchewan. What made you think I can be an Olympic hockey player and then I'll be a doctor?
Well, I grew up with 2 parallel dreams, which was one was to play for the Edmonton Oilers and win a Stanley Cup because my heroes were Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier and the Oilers of the 80s. And then alongside that, very early on, there was a little girl in our neighborhood who was backed over by a grocery delivery truck, and she was injured. And we had a kind of a posse of kids in our neighborhood that went to visit her at the hospital. So I got inspired by the doctors and nurses there, just by being around the hospital all the time, and just was like, oh, this would be a really interesting career. And my dad was a science teacher. My parents were teachers, so they always said, you're going to need a life after hockey. You can't probably do this forever. And so those were sort of my 2 parallel goals growing up.
And interestingly, you say, a similar skill set, for what you were, an Olympic hockey player and an emergency room doctor.
Mm-hmm. Very similar. Yeah, very similar. In fact, every single day in the emergency department, all the skills I learned as an athlete, I'm using. So preparation, teamwork, think on your feet, make decisions quickly. You have to be decisive. You have to learn how to work with people, help people. They're all the same things that we used inside of hockey every single day. So I find that action, that fast pace, never the same thing twice, that really is what the emergency room's all about.
It made me laugh in your book when I got to page, I think it was 87 or something, where you go, I'm a pretty driven, intense person. You think?
Yeah, I think it just comes from within. I've always been like that since I was a kid. I think a pretty high-strung kid. My parents would say they're very, very calm and low-key and laid back. So never did I ever feel pushed or like this was somebody else's idea to do these things. It was always from me. In fact, many times growing up, my mom and dad would say, like, are you sure you want to do this? It's getting hard, or you don't have to. And I would always say, no, this is what I'm going to do. So stubborn, driven, probably the same thing.
But it did sound like an idyllic childhood in Shaunavon, Saskatchewan, with watching hockey games with your dad and sort of picking apart the great players and studying them, and particularly the stories you tell about your grandfather, who's this big, strong farmer.
My grandpa John Eberts, he's passed now, but the joke was he has the biggest hands I've ever seen on another human. He'd play a piano key and his finger would cover 3 keys, just massive hands. He wasn't a tall man, but he was a wide man and hardworking. And 6 kids on the farm, growing up, self-made. And so as a little girl, I idolized him. And all my cousins who lived on the farm, we lived in town, but they lived on the farm. They couldn't wait to get off the farm and do chores, and I couldn't wait to get on the farm and do chores. So pick rocks, throw bales, drive the tractor, ride the horses, whatever it was. And so he instilled in us very young that if you're going to make anything of yourself, you better be the hardest working person in the room, and that's all that mattered. So that, in his eyes, for me, that was all that mattered. So I was just going to work as hard as I could, and then I would get that approval. So he was a big influence in my life, and I think in a very good way.
And you had the backyard rink, the pond, which is, to the point of, Wayne Gretzky calling you the female Gordie Howe. It's the classic Gordie Howe, learn to play, just play by yourself for hours, which you did.
I did, yeah. My dad built the rink, and it was in between 3 houses in a back alley. And like I say, 30 kids in the neighborhood, and I spent the most time on that outdoor rink, more than anyone, but it was the place where I could go out, dream, try things, experiment, freeze my butt off, play free, just spend hours and hours and hours out there. And I did. I would sneak out at night when everybody was sleeping, and just the stars would light the ice, and I would practice. And my dad would hear like bang, bang, and he'd know that it was me out, and he'd open the door and be like, "Get to bed." So but that's just what we knew. And honestly, it was probably a lot to do with the fact that there was nothing else to do in our town. It was hockey, curling, or there was no phones, there was no Xbox. Like, you were always having to create your own stuff to do.
Well, the idyllic times seemed to end when you started to play a lot of hockey. And then, as you say, you had to fight your way. You fought the whole time, and changing in closets, sleeping in a closet when you went to a boys' hockey camp, changing, and what's that Sarah Palin line, the difference between a pit bull and a hockey mom? Lipstick.
Right.
They were horrible to you.
Yeah.
Calling you freak.
Yeah.
Get out of here. You don't belong. You shouldn't be here. Nobody wanted you there.
Yeah, that's very true on many occasions. I think originally when I started, obviously when you're 6, 7 years old, it's not quite like that. As I got older, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that was when it really started to pour on, where parents and mostly moms from other teams would just harass you, or I had one mom come in the dressing room I was changing in, and it was like kind of it didn't have a roof, but it was in the middle of the lobby, and there was renovations, and she opened the door and said, "You don't belong, get away from my son, da 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 da." And I remember I turned to her and I said, "Well, if he could actually skate." So it was my way of like trying to protect myself, and I was 9 years old at the time. And so these are the times when my parents would say, like, "Are you sure you want to keep going? You don't have to play. There's lots of other sports you can do." And it was always me, and no, I'm going to keep going. And I think it was because I knew that I was pretty good. I loved the game, and I just thought, if I just get through going to the rink, getting dressed, and getting on the ice, if I just get through that part, then the rest is okay. And I did that continually for well into my teens, and then.
Well, you had an ulcer at 14.
I did, yeah. I remember one night I had developed an ulcer just from the stress, and it got to be overwhelming. I was 14, 15, somewhere in there, so it was Bantam AAA in Calgary. And that was a hard time, because you're on the cusp of, players getting drafted, taking someone else's job. And so there was a different set of pressures and circumstances that came with that.
You got cut from a AAA team. It was the boys' team in Calgary. You think after all the abuse you'd taken all those years to play with the boys,
yeah.
That one you said just left a big scar. I would have thought you were scar-proof at that point.
Well, I think it's like, we talk about microaggressions. It's all these little ticks through the years, and I was pretty good with all of them. But that one was AAA midget in Calgary, and I had gone away to a tournament in Medicine Hat and had a pretty good tournament. And I came back to home. It was Father David Bauer parking lot. My mom was waiting there to pick me up. I got off the bus, the coach said, "Hey, can I talk to you?" And I'm expecting him to say, like, "Oh, we're going to try a power play," or something. And he said very honestly, like, I'm sorry, but I can't handle having a girl on the team. I'm going to have to let you go. And I think we were 15 or so games into the season, and he cut me right on the spot. And I remember walking out, and my mom, no cell phones to text or anything. So my mom's like, "Oh, well, it sounded like it went pretty good. How'd it go?" And then I just was like, I just got cut. And my mom kind of went ballistic. "What? This is a human rights issue?" And, some of the same things that we had experienced when I was a lot younger. And so she was like hell-bent on driving over to the president of the area. But I said, "No, don't do that. I'm going to prove them wrong another way." And I was just so tired of dealing with it up to that point that I couldn't really fight anymore, and I didn't want to. And then shortly after that, I joined the national team.
You started playing with the national women's team in Canada at age 15, so you were, the little baby on the team.
I was. They called me High Chair Hayley because I was so young. But I was lucky. I was surrounded by women who were full-on professionals. I remember I was a grade 10 math student, and my roommate, Margot Page, poor woman, she was a grade 10 math teacher. So she got stuck with me, the 15-year-old. And it was women like her, France St. Louis, Stacey Wilson, Geraldine Heaney, Judy Diddick, Angela James, these types of women early on that they taught me how to be a pro. They taught me how to train. They also worked mostly full-time jobs and also played on the national team. It wasn't like it is today where you can do it as a living. So I was really lucky. I got surrounded by some great people early on.
So you headed off to your first Olympics, which was Nagano,
Yeah.
with sort of like, we're winners, we always win, and it's always Team USA you're playing in the finals.
Yeah.
And you lost.
We did.
And
yeah.
you couldn't handle it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the matter of the fact is we kind of choked. We went in as heavy favorites, first Olympics, and we didn't play well. I even forget what the score. I think it was 4-1.
I forget the
3-1.
score.
I don't know. All I know is we lost the game. And I remember standing on the blue line, trying not to cry, looking across at the Americans with the gold medal, and I had never once to that point thought about losing. I had only thought we were just going to go there and win. I was so kind of naive to perspective at that time. And that was a really hard thing to get through, but maybe the best thing in the end.
But it was never any less intense when you came to play Team USA.
Oh no.
You say it was war. It was always war.
Yeah, it was. For me, I needed it to be like that, and it was like that. It's changed, I think, in recent years as players cross borders and you have pro hockey and things like that. But for us in the early Olympics, it was a Cold War. Like the border, that was the border. Canadians played in Canada and the Americans played in the US. And I remember like being in hotels and the elevator would open, and if there were American players on that elevator, I'll take the stairs. I'll take another elevator. I needed to hate them to play well for myself. It was, I could not be friends. I could not.
Ever? Is this healthy?
No.
Ever? Can you talk to them now? Have you ever gotten
Sure.
over this, Hayley?
I'm over it. I remember I joined the IOC Athletes Commission, and Angela Ruggiero, the great American player, was the chair of the commission, and she walked up to me and said, well, I guess we have to learn to be friends now. This was in 2014, so it took me a while, but yeah, you know, it's changed now. But I think for me to play well, it needed to be that really divisive, that's them and this is us, and that's just what made it work.
And you got happy 4 more times with gold medals after that.
Yeah, we got the upper hand after 1 loss and 4 good wins. Yeah.
And your endurance is legendary. What didn't Sports Illustrated call you one of the 25 toughest athletes in the world? And you'd be, you know, your training is legendary. You say to yourself, I'm not hungry, I'm not in pain, I'm not exhausted. And it worked?
Yeah, it did work.
Jeez.
Yeah, I would kind of play games with myself that way, and just ways to sort of get around fatigue and push through barriers where you didn't think you could. And we did a lot of crazy stuff when I was, you know, training too. I used to train with the Hunter brothers from Shaunavon, Saskatchewan, and Jungle Jim Hunter, the crazy Canuck skier. He was our trainer for a couple of years, and we used to ride our bikes from Calgary to Nelson, BC in 3 days, like over 600 kilometers or 800 kilometers, whatever it is. And we wouldn't stop. We would eat on the bike, we would drink on the bike, and we'd only stop to do other training or sleep. And we'd get to Nelson, we would dip our bikes in the lake, get in the minivan, and drive back to Calgary. And it was just a way to steal the mind and steal the body. So I would do crazy things like that, just because I felt like this was important as this.
Well, and after the Olympics, you'd go, well, I'll train Bobby Clark and the Philadelphia Flyer. I'll just always pushing yourself. Then you went to Finland and played men's professional hockey. You were the first woman to do that. Mm-hmm. In a strange country, alone, mm-hmm. You know, getting knocked around the ice by people who wanted to show you a thing or two. It sounds awful. And you went, oh no, it's really a good 2 years of my life. Loved it.
It was, yeah, you know what? It wasn't awful in that sense. It was physically challenging because I knew I had to be at my best every day, whether it was a practice or a game playing pro men's hockey. And I did 2 years in Finland and 1 year in Sweden in 2008. But I knew that it was going to make me better. And I think that I always sort of strove to do things that would push me out of my comfort zone, because my theory was I will train harder than any game will ever be. So the games will always feel easy and the training will always feel harder. So that was sort of the way that I approached everything that I did.
Was it hard to retire from hockey? Finally hang up your skate? It was a long time, Hayley.
Yeah, an eternity. I think my mom was happy. I think she was like, oh, thank God this is over.
And your son.
Yeah, yeah, and my son was happy. No, yes, it was. It was hard to retire. It was, you know, one thing you did your whole life. You're 38 years old, and then it's like, wow, this is over. And I've been doing this since I was 5 years old. What's next? But I had, along the way, always had this other plan, which was to do medicine. So I don't think any of my teammates were surprised when, you know, I retired and 3 months later I'm stepping into medical school.
And then, because you also then got a job with the Toronto Maple Leafs, like right around the same time. They went, come and work with us in player development. So you were doing med school and working for the Leafs in 2 different cities.
Yes,
at the same time.
Yeah, I actually, when I retired from hockey, I thought, that's it. I'm never going back to hockey, like new life, here we go. And I was kind of okay with that. 2 months into medical school, Kyle Dubas, the general manager of the Leafs at the time, called and said, would you like a job to work with us? Pretty hard to turn down.
I made it to the NHL.
That's what my mom said. Well, you finally made it. So so I commuted 5-6 times a month, Calgary to Toronto, in the initial years finishing med school, and then when I started my residency, I moved to Toronto to do my residency and to live full time.
And now assistant general manager at the Leafs, player development and emergency room doctor. You talked about the first time you were in an emergency room as a med student and looking after a boy who'd overdosed.
Yeah. It was my first day in med school, and I had shadowed one of my friends for many years, and a very experienced emerg doc, and she said, why don't you come in for the first shift? You're actually legit, you can do something. So I went to the orientation, and then I walked over to the emergency department, and not even 5 minutes in, we got a call saying fire and EMS were bringing a young man in, found down on the C train in Calgary. People thought he was sleeping, but it was a suspected overdose, and that they were working on him, and they were on their way. So she turned to me and said, well, welcome to medicine, day 1. You're going to do CPR, gown, glove, and mask. Let's go. And then assembled the team, and I totally panicked inside. Why didn't you stick to hockey? Why did you decide to do this? But I quickly kind of gathered myself, and they brought him in, and I traded CPR with a couple other people, and he didn't survive. So it was a heck of a first day in medical school, but my first patient, the first human being I laid hands on like that. And he was about the same age as my son. He could have been my son. And I remember standing over top of him, a million thoughts in that moment. It's just such a crazy thing. And I just put my hand on his arm and I said, I don't know where you're going, but I hope it's a good place. And that was it. And that actually really reaffirmed for me why I wanted to do medicine. He didn't survive, but just being able to help people in their worst moments, there's something that's very satisfying when you have lived a life of only worrying about yourself as an athlete. So it's nice to kind of get out of that a bit.
Now we've mentioned your son, Noah, who you adopted as a preemie, 1 pound, 10 ounce little tiny baby when you were 21 years old.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, he was born 3 months premature, so a little sooner than was expected. And at the time, Thomas, my ex's dad, and I were, everything was rolling along, and it was like, okay, well, I guess being from Saskatchewan, this is just what we do. Okay, we're gonna, this little baby's coming along, and I never thought about not doing it. This little boy is in our life, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna figure it out. I had a lot of help from my mom and dad and my sister. helped a lot in that initial first year because I was traveling and I was playing a lot. So I never would have chosen to have a child at 21 years old, but he's the best thing that ever happened to me. He came into my life and he taught me a lot about perspective, and he still does. Doesn't like hockey, could care less about the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's great. So, but those were challenging first couple of years, but it was really good for me, actually.
Mm-hmm. You're very outspoken. And I mean, you've had success on, Twitter/X or whatever. There are a couple of stories that are really interesting. One about during COVID, one of your colleagues said, which was universal, we don't have protective equipment, we don't have protective gear, and you went, this is unacceptable, I'm going to change this, and put something out on Twitter and started an organization and, decided to do something about that.
Yeah, that was the Conquer COVID-19. So I couldn't believe it. I never thought I'd be a med student in a pandemic. And then I'm right in the mix of this, running around the hospital looking for N95s for Ontario's first COVID patient that walked through the door. I was in the emergency room that night. And that was my job, find the N95s, and I couldn't. We eventually scrounged up enough, but then my friends who were attending physicians were saying, we're going to run out, and these are people from across the country. So I just tweeted it out, and then with a little help from a guy named Ryan Reynolds.
Who you'd met at an award ceremony.
Yeah, we met at Canada's Walk of Fame, and we had stayed in contact and become friends, and so Ryan said, can I help amplify it? So it was really Ryan out to the universe, 200 people galvanized, 8 weeks, they raised $2.3 million and 3 million items of PPE to 550 locations. So it was a cool thing. It was very Canadian, for all these people that didn't know each other. They got together and said, we've got a problem that our government can't fix right now, so we're going to do it. And they saved a lot of lives, by doing this. So it was one of the best teams I've been a part of.
But you've done the same thing, more recently with neck guards. Everyone's got to wear that. I mean, you want to make hockey safer, better.
Yeah, better. I think these are just common sense things. I think for me, there's certain things that I feel okay, I may have the expertise to speak out on. Neck guards, I personally have had 2 very close calls with players. I have been in the rink when they've been cut in the neck in the last few years in the Leafs organization, and I've had to stitch them up. So I seen it firsthand. I lived it as an athlete. I wore a neck guard for 20-some years. So this is just something we can do, and it doesn't interfere with how you play the game at all.
Tell me about meeting Nelson Mandela.
Well, he was, everyone knows Nelson Mandela. He just, first thing I noticed, he's much taller. Have you met him? You probably have.
I did. Yeah. I always wanted to interview him. He was the one I never got him. What a man. What a man.
Yeah, what a man. And I just remember walking into the Athletes Village in Sydney in 2000, and I had a chance to sit and listen to him talk to South African athletes. He was more weathered in his face. I guess 20 years in prison will do that. But just so kind and calm, and I often think about him in today's Middle Eastern conflict. What would a Mandela do? What would a really transformational leader like that do? So he talked to the athletes about, yes, you're an athlete, and yes, you do your sport, but what is your legacy going to be? And how are you going to leave the world a better place through what you do? And that was his message to the South African athletes, and I got a chance to sit in and listen to that. And he was very impactful in my life. I had his books. I have his photo on my wall in my home prior to this. And then I took my son to Cape Town, and we went to Robben Island and did a little pilgrimage to see that cell, that very small cell that he was trapped in for all those years. So yeah, a great leader. Yeah.
So what is your mark? How are you making the world a better place?
I think for me, I'm not trying to leave a legacy. I think I'm just doing what I do, and I hope that by what I do, it makes the trail a little easier, a little smoother for young girls coming up in hockey, that, hey, if they don't have to walk into a rink and hear the harassment that I did, then that's a win. I have my hockey festival called WickFest. 13 years, we work with 30,000 young girls from coast to coast and around the world. So for me, that's the most impactful thing that I can do to give back to the game because the game has been so good to me. So, you know, I think now a lot about like getting outside of myself, and that's in the world of medicine. I'm able to help other people. I spent a long time thinking about myself, and I think that's my way to sort of also give back. That I feel very proud to be Canadian and very lucky to live in Canada. And
because the question that we always end with is, what does being Canadian mean to you?
It's just, we're so fortunate. You just have to turn on the news and my gosh, like what's happening in other parts of the world. So I think being Canadian stands for freedom, democracy, equality for all, and we have to continue to fight for those things in this country because they are so important, and we need to lead the world, I think, in many ways, because if Canada doesn't do it in some ways, I don't know who else will.
Well, it's lovely to be able to talk to you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you
It's an
so
honor.
much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Valerie.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Michael McCain and family, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, Tony and Sherry Fell, Mary Davey, the Browning Watt Foundation, David and Cheryl Carr, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Earl and Janice Oborn, the Linwood Family Foundation, Steve and Catherine Coxford, Richard Pilosoff, Clinch House Foundation, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association,